Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Vincent Lau, and I am a senior manager on the Columbia Justice Lab's Youth Justice Initiatives team. The YJI team it aims to create a world where all youth, especially youth of color and those who have long been marginalized, have the opportunities and supports they need to grow, flourish, and thrive in their homes and communities outside of the legal system. Today's panel on harnessing data for transformation is the fifth in our Taking on Transformation series, which outlines key steps for system leaders across the country to consider as they shift away from the youth prison model and create a community-centered approach. To find out more about the series, if you've missed the previous episodes and events, please watch the recordings that we have on past panels. Visit our website at takingontransformation.org. Once again, the website is takingontransformation.org, and I'm sure one of my colleagues will list that here in the chat as well. So today's webinar is co-hosted by the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice, an affinity group of current and past youth justice administrators who are calling for an end to youth prisons and pushing for investment in communities. This conversation will be a much anticipated dive into the importance of data for transformation processes and the best practices around collecting and utilizing data that really honor the values of racial justice, centering youth and family, and pushing for bold change. So before we get into it today, I just wanted to take a moment to thank our funders and partners without whom we could not do this work. I also want to remind everyone that even though this will remain a closed panel, we will aim to reserve time at the end for panelists to answer questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature on this Zoom link at any time to submit questions throughout this discussion. You might, because we may not see questions that are pasted into the chat, so definitely use the Q&A feature if you want your question to be looked at. And lastly, we will record this event and post it on our project website at, again, takingontransformation.org, where you'll also be able to watch our past panels. So originally we were supposed to have Patrick McCarthy as our moderator today, but he's unfortunately not able to join us today. But so happy to have our own YJI co-director, Vidya Ananthakrishnan, who will be stepping in for today's discussion. So Vidya is my fearless co-leader, is the co-director of our Youth Justice Initiatives team here at the Justice Lab, and she supports YJI's fundraising efforts and guides YJI's advocacy, strategic communications, and narrative research work. She also works closely with a range of partners across the country, including YCLJ. Previously, Vidya had worked at the Vera Institute of Justice, where she was involved in numerous local, state, and national youth justice efforts to keep young people out of custody. So with that, I will now turn it over to Vidya, who will be our moderator for today. And once again, welcome everyone to this panel.
Thanks so much, Vincent, for that introduction. I'm Vidya Ananthakrishnan, and as Vincent mentioned, I do co-direct our Youth Justice Initiatives team at the lab. I'm really, really honored and excited to be able to moderate this conversation today, because I think sometimes data can be an underappreciated part of how we think about transformation and how we can use it effectively in telling the stories of young people and making sure that we're really pushing for the changes that we need. We're really lucky to be joined by some amazing panelists. And before we really get into the conversation, I wanted to quickly introduce them all. And we'll also be posting their full bios on the project website following this panel. So we'll begin with Susan Burke, who is the executive director of the CARI Group and also serves as a steering committee member for the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice. Susan has over 30 years of experience working in the justice field, having previously run Utah's Youth Justice Department, served as the president of the American Probation and Parole Association, and sitting on the board of directors for the National Association of Probation Executives. Welcome, Susan. Marcia Rincon Gallardo is Executive Director of the Alianza for Youth Justice, Principal of Nochtin Equal Justice for All, Adjunct MSW Policy Professor, and author. At Alianza, she directs the coalition's efforts to amplify visibility and advocacy of Chicanx, Latinx to transform youth injustice systems with long-term solutions rooted in cultura, comunidad, and healing. She has extensive experience implementing strategies to end the use of incarceration, utilizing locally based healing informed community-centered approaches. And welcome to Marcia too. Yamanda Wright is a research psychologist at RTI International and a fellow with the National Juvenile Justice Network. Dr. Wright is a developmental psychologist specializing in evaluating criminal legal system policies, practices, and outcomes for people across their lifespan. She's led several mixed method assessments for 4 legislatures and 6 state agencies using data to improve processes at the local and state levels. She's also served as Director of Research at Texas Appleseed and worked also at the Crime and Justice Institute. So we're really pleased to have you here, Yamanda. Thanks. So with that, I think, it probably makes sense for us to sort of jump right into this panel and get us going a little bit. And as a starting point, I guess I want to sort of pull back a little and ask each of you to talk a little bit about your perspective and where you're coming from when it comes to thinking about data and how you would define data. So I'll leave it open to have one of you jump in. I don't know, maybe I'll start with Susan and then we can go from there.
All right, thank you, Vidya. It's great to be here today. So my perspective is really coming from the point of view of a justice system administrator. I spent 7 years as director of Utah's Division of Juvenile Justice Services. We are a state agency that's responsible for the operations of youth services and receiving centers, 11 detention centers, community-based and early intervention services, 5 long-term secure facility and parole functions, essentially everything but probation. And probation is where I came from before I joined the division. For me, data is more than just about numbers. I think it's really crucial to being able to make decisions as an administrator. Data really equals knowledge. And when you have knowledge, you have the wisdom to be able to make better and more informed decisions. But you often have to look beyond the numbers. So early in my career, I was working at the Salt Lake Area Gang Project, and data for us really just revolved around documenting numbers. How many gang members we had, how many gang crimes, what types of gang crimes. But then when I moved up to the governor's office to work on justice policy, data became much more than that. That was when I understood that data could really tell a very comprehensive story. It could tell us what is the current state of things as well as what could be through statistical modeling. And that's definitely not my background, but it's something that I learned that we could use data in a way that could tell a more full story. And I learned that data is not the answer, but data is the beginning of asking questions about what is really going on in our systems and how we can make it better.
That's super helpful. And I think actually dovetails well to sort of move on to some of our other panelists to share. So maybe we can have Yamanda jump in a little bit.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. As you mentioned in your introduction, I'm a developmental psychologist by training. So I'm interested in how people's lives interact with institutions, especially government and longstanding institutions, and how those institutions can either reflect and respect their lived experience or sort of counter or undermine their development as human beings and as individuals. And so from this perspective, I have a really expansive view of data that, like Susan, includes not just statistics and numbers, but also people's personal stories and the value that they draw from those personal stories. And so I'm really excited and glad to see that as part of this panel and as part of Columbia's work, they have that expansive view of data to include not only quantitative, but also qualitative data. I also come to this work as a person from a predominantly Black and Brown community in Texas. I grew up in Third Ward, Houston, which it has a long history of community activism and civil rights activism, and has a powerful group of advocates that are sort of leaders in the community that drive what kinds of resources come to the community and have a lot of political power. And I learned from that upbringing just the power of grassroots organizing and the power of youth justice movements. And so as a researcher, I'm also really interested in how young people across the country have led the transformation of these systems, pulling them away from a model that is incarceration based, or that claims that incarceration is the only way that we can connect youth to the services of the community. So I'll stop there. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I think that's a really important perspective. I mean, people's sort of backgrounds really inform how they look at and view data and what it can kind of show or not show. And so, Marcia, I'd love to hear a little bit more about, your take on that as well.
Sure. I'm so happy to be here with all of you and the diversity, even of us, the panelists. And so I want to thank the Justice Lab and you, Vidya, for inviting us and inviting me. I think about my early days of being in college and really questioning even before that, as a young person in a predominantly brown community in La Puente, California, issues of equity. How my mom could get into mental health services and how she wasn't getting the right type of services. And I wasn't necessarily using data then, but I was thinking data. I didn't know that it was data that I was asking about. And it had to do with how many of us were in the community and yet how far she had to go away to actually get to the services. And so, throughout my lifetime, I've worked in lots of different spaces. As a social worker, I eventually received an MSW, but I pretty much remained as a policy advocate. And so data has been sort of a very practical piece, not something that you do a report and you submit to someone, but more as a strategy to actually get what we demand and what we want and what we need to make changes. So as people from community, how do we use data to actually make changes? And in this case, early in my career, we started doing a whole lot of reform work. It's exactly 20 years that I worked with then Building Blocks for Youth. A lot of major leaders who at that time were in Building Blocks now, started their own organizations. But back in 20 years ago, we wrote a report called Donde está la Justicia? It lives on our website. And if you were to read it today, it has the same recommendations that we would be saying today, which is collect accurate data on Brown youth. And, so 20 years later that we're still not doing that is abominable, right? It's like, how inappropriate is this that we still can't collect the right data on all these youth that sit in these facilities all over this country? But it's the same thing with a lot of other young people. And we're talking about gender expansive, LGBTQ young people. We're talking about tribal youth. We're talking about all these Afro-Latinos, indigenous young people, that by collecting that data accurately, as we close down facilities, we need to have that data. We need to know the zip codes where these young people come from in order to create what is needed and the scaling that it's needed in the communities, in the neighborhoods where they come from. So for me, it's a very practical, it's also about power. Like, how can we even demand the right size, the right kind of services and even resources if we don't have the accurate data? And if the system is the only one who holds on to this data without sharing, it's difficult for community to step in and be part of the process. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I get very passionate. My colleagues and friends know that I can get blue in the face talking about data.
I think those were incredibly powerful points. And I think that actually leads really nicely into like another topic, which is part of what we've been trying to do in this series. And we started this series off by really focusing on key values that we think should be at the heart of all of this work, including centering racial justice and equity, and really being mindful of young people and families at the forefront at every point, right? And really being aware of whether what we're doing actually is advancing their well-being and their health, and sort of making them ready for that next step. And I think Marcia and also Yamanda, the things that you were raising really, sort of brings to light questions about how well do we really think systems are doing when it comes to collecting and analyzing data with those values in mind, and what are some of the gaps there and why. And I think, I'm opening it up to everybody, but I know Marcia, you started to touch on some of this.
So there definitely is, and as we were all preparing, we had that thought of, currently we collect data based on how the system was intended to run and what it was intended to do. But if what we're thinking is to end incarceration and build what we need in the community, then that's a different set of questions of how we need to collect data and why we need to collect data and for what purposes. And so I just really am happy. We do a lot of work to build capacity of directly impacted individuals to understand data so that they are at the table centered in creating not only what is needed, but in this case, also the data that we're going to need to assure that we're doing correctly on behalf of young people. And so everything from, what does success mean? What does success mean to come through a process that actually is healing and transformative for young people? And then based on what we believe, our communities believe is success, then what is the data that we need to assure that that's what we're doing? That how we are spending money is actually creating what we want in our communities. I think so often what I've seen across the country is that data has shown us that we are still holding young people that are, in this case, I'm going to use a term, low and medium risk, based on a tool that's called the Risk Assessment Instrument. And that tool primarily says, if you're low risk, you should be outright released. If you're medium risk, you should be sent to an alternative to incarceration. And if you're high risk, you should be detained. We know from data from all over this country that primarily who sits in detention is low and medium risk individuals. Now, our young people don't know that. They themselves don't know that. They often ask when they find out about this instrument, they say, well, what was my score? Really wanting to know what happened to them, who made these decisions and how were they made? So all that to say that there are ways in which we all need to shift in thinking about what data. We currently do have certain data that we need in order to even end incarceration, to really challenge ourselves to think beyond this thing that we've created that only is the hammer and the nail, and yet our communities have so much more than the hammer and the nail.
Thanks for that. Yamanda, do you want to add anything here? I know some of these points were raised yesterday in some of our conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with Marcia about needing to shift our thinking about what success means so that there's alignment between systems and the people that they are funded to serve. And also asking youth about how they would label themselves, how they would categorize themselves, if at all, and building in that information into the data systems, because these systems, again, were not designed for research. They weren't designed for transformation. They were designed for, a lot of times, case management, accounting, all of these other agency-related uses that don't necessarily reflect the values and the language of the people who they serve. So I would absolutely agree with that. And I would add that another key sort of movement that is happening right now is making sure the variables in these systems are actually getting at what they're meant to get at. And it's a change that I'd love to see. Because when the systems weren't designed for change, they have these categories that don't necessarily reflect the things that researchers and communities are interested in. And we have to be intentional about redefining those variables so that they serve the outcomes that we want to see.
Can you
Uh,
talk? Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. No. go
I
ahead.
was just going to ask you, can you maybe offer an example of a variable that you're talking about, or what it might have been intended for and why it might not serve what folks are hoping to do now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think an example that all the folks in this panel and all the people listening are really familiar with are just the categories of race and ethnicity, and how those categories can be really, really sparse, I will say, and in like the most generous way, and can collapse people into really crude categories based on how they're originally identified by law enforcement or other system professionals. So I've seen systems in which for race, the only two categories are Black and white. And not only are those the only two categories, but those two categories are based on what the law enforcement officer perceives the person's race to be. And when we research those data, when we use those data for research, we're assuming that those racial categories are also how the young person themselves identify. And that's very clearly not always the case if we only have two categories of Black and white. There's a whole spectrum of youth who are being left out of that, and therefore conclusions are being drawn that don't necessarily apply to or benefit those youth. And so there has been, for example, a movement away from those really crude categories to more expansive categories of race and gender and sexual orientation and all other kinds of demographics that truly are starting to get closer to how youth define themselves, and to being able to, sort of triangulate on the outcomes we would like to see.
That's great. And Susan, I'm wondering if you can talk at all about, how this may have played out for you in as a system administrator, and to what degree, there were thoughts about how any adjustments could be made, given what some of the points were that were raised by Marcia and Amanda.
Absolutely. I heard some really important things that were raised about how we measure success in our system. And, one of the comments is that we really need to humanize data. We really need to understand what data means from the human perspective, from the youth perspective, from the family perspective, from the community perspective. I was fortunate in working in a system where people were aware of the diversity of our community and were then willing to have categories that represented that diversity in our data collection. So it wasn't just a category that said other, it was a category that really broke down people by different types of races. As somebody who is part Asian, I'm often lumped into Asian Pacific Islander, this big, broad category, which really doesn't represent the person that I am and the culture that I represent. And someone who does not know about the different cultures would look at that category and just assume certain stereotypes about different racial categories. One of my experiences as an administrator is I was fortunate enough to head up a national committee with the Council of Juvenile Justice Administrators focusing on recidivism and data. And one of the things we discovered in working with agencies across the country is that, one, most justice system agencies don't have a dedicated person to even look at data, let alone research or analyze data. We need to change that. We need justice systems to put value on being able to assess how well they're doing, and also being able to identify the areas where they're falling short. And it can't be just someone who just is doing this on the side. It needs to be a dedicated, experienced person. And there are agencies that have made that commitment. In my work, we had great folks from Virginia, Maryland, Washington, Oregon, Florida, a variety of different states that were truly committed to looking at data in our justice system and helping to develop some standards associated with data. Right now, we do not have national standards associated with measuring whether our system is doing well or not. The only measure that people talk about is numbers in our system, our populations, and recidivism. And I know from personal experience, recidivism does not tell the whole story. We have young people who come out of our systems. And I met a young lady who came out, she did really well. She was on parole. She went to a party, made a mistake, got a citation. And according to the data, she's a failure because she had a follow-up contact with the justice system. But this young lady, let me tell you, she is the furthest thing from a failure. She went on to college, she completed college. She is very successful now in what she's doing. But the way our systems are set up, we would not acknowledge that success or that effort and that behavior change, unfortunately.
And what would it look like, I guess I want to pose this to everyone, what would it look like to really approach this differently, where we think about data much more from the perspective of not failure, but young people as full of promise and opportunity, who are kind of taking steps and sometimes not always doing them perfectly the first time, because who does, right? What would that take? What would that look like? And I'm curious to know if there are any examples of places that you're seeing that have been trying to move in that direction.
I think the challenge for our systems is that they don't talk to each other. And we don't have that agreed upon, like I said, definition of how we define success. We have kids who are touched by our education, human services systems, employment. We lose track of kids. We're not able to identify areas where we can measure if they are now at a better state of well-being. What standardized tools exist to show that this young person has increased their well-being as a result of services that have been provided.
I want to piggyback on what Susan said. I work very closely here in Santa Clara County with the Young Women's Freedom Center, and utilizing YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research, and centering young people at policy tables where they also define what are the variables, what are the metrics for success. I continually laugh at the fact that even the language that we use to say what is well-being is so different. When I'm sitting in a circle of directly impacted young individuals compared to systems folks, it's almost like we're speaking two different languages. And so that matters. It matters that our families also get to be involved in also developing what are those metrics and variables, and that they're involved in the process of obtaining that information. So I think both Yamanda and Susan mentioned, both qualitative and quantitative research that so sometimes our community-based organizations that do excellent work in the community, they don't have the funding to be able to prove that they are evidence-based programming. And so as a consequence, who ends up getting all the dollars to deliver services that sometimes are not even made for our young people of color. They haven't been even tested, or, what is the validity of it being a one-size-fits-all versus very much customized for our different and very diverse communities. So I think that there's a long way for us to go, but certainly at the very most first step is centering our young people, that they are at the table to address how it is that we collect this data and for what reasons.
And what does that look like in some of the places that you all have been, involved with, like when young people have in fact been at those tables? Like, how has that process worked the best? And, what kinds of questions have you been able to kind of dig into with them? And what have been sort of some of the most surprising things you've learned in those types of processes? I'm going to turn it to you, Amanda, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a range of participatory action research from community engagement in the most, I'll say like superficial way, in that it can be just a communications effort where decisions are being made by system professionals, and those decisions are being very carefully communicated to the community, and youth are being brought in to help with that communication and reception of those policies. So that's one end of the spectrum. And I think on the other end of the spectrum, which is where I hope the field is moving as a whole, is having authentic community engagement and authentic participation from youth, in which youth are encouraged and supported and challenging the system and how it's structured to unevenly apply justice across different groups of youth. I think one thing that I think is so important, in addition to bringing youth in and asking them what they think and what their experiences have been, is to expand the sphere of accountability to these agencies as well. Because, for example, there are states, there are communities, there are jurisdictions across the country where two youth who have the exact same charged offense, right? And the exact same level of violence, let's say, in the offense that they're being charged with, will be treated differently depending on what judge they're assigned to, or depending on defense counsel, or depending on things that have nothing to do with their behavior. And I think youth want to know, young people want to know why that's the case, but they don't necessarily feel empowered in these rooms full of professionals, system professionals with a lot of power, to ask those questions, to challenge those assumptions, to basically go out there and challenge white supremacy in institutions. And so I think as researchers, as system professionals, we have to be really aware of like where the power lies in the room and do things to counteract disruptive power dynamics that keep youth from actually fully participating in this process and giving real authentic feedback to the systems about how they can change and about how they can be more equitable.
And what would you say that looks like? What are some of those sort of really concrete ways that that can be done to sort of counteract what you're saying, which I think is a real present dynamic in a lot of places?
I mean, I think there are a lot of ways, but just to take one small example, I have seen some jurisdictions really consider barriers to participation, whether that be transportation to a meeting, whether it be compensation for time, whether it be acknowledgement and co-authorship on briefs that are written about the youth that come to the panel. I think those are just like low-hanging fruits that can happen from the very beginning of a process to show that you're not just leaning on you to help you communicate a decision that's already been made, but you're compensating and recognizing and respecting you as experts in this process because they are the experts. So many of the people who are making decisions have never been through a juvenile justice system, have never been through an adult criminal legal system as a person who has been charged. And so they have no personal experience about how that feels, and also maybe some assumptions that are totally inaccurate about the drivers of justice and health and personal safety. And so to the extent that we can make sure that you are protected and compensated and recognized for their participation in these panels, I think that would help a lot.
Thanks for all of that. Susan or Marcia, do you want to add anything to any of what Amanda had shared?
I'll share what we did as we embarked on juvenile justice reform, because we certainly wanted to hear from kids, and we had two different types of experiences. We had experiences where we brought, kids together that were in our programs and facilities into focus group for a discussion, and that provided us good information. But I still felt that we put the kids in a very difficult position because we didn't want them to risk feeling as if they said something negative about the system, that it would somehow impact their stay in the system. So as we recognized that, we then did what Yamanda had indicated. We identified kids that were previously involved in the system. We provided them transportation. We compensated them for their time. We brought them together and asked them, tell us what worked for you in the system, where improvements are needed. And those discussions were really powerful because the young people had the time to actually reflect on that experience and how it had impacted them previously and how it continues to impact them. And we learned so much from their experience. And one of the important things we learned is that we need to make their time in our system the most meaningful as possible. And we need to limit their time in our system and try and create avenues for them to return back to their community with the support and help they need to be successful. They shouldn't have to receive treatment behind closed doors if treatment can be made available in their home or in their community, and make that something that can help improve outcomes for them.
That's great. I also just want to touch on this idea to go back a little bit on, because people keep talking about needing to define success and how we think about what these metrics really should be. I know folks in the chat have been talking a little bit about how we've constantly shaped everything from this sort of deficiency place of scarcity and absence, right? And instead, how do we think about things in terms of abundance? So I am wondering about, what are some of those metrics that help go beyond just the individual context to into sort of community context and well-being, and how do we kind of promote that type of lens in this work?
Well, first of all, I want to say that rarely have we gone to community in the sense of those most impacted, those who have been incarcerated, and sat down and, first of all, invested some time and energy in describing. We go through a process of even, we start first with history, and then the history of our people, and because so much of that is missing, to then understand and center how did these systems come to be, and the values behind these systems. So once we name not only the colonization and all these words that we use today, white supremacy and entitlement and so on. And so once we're able to do that, then we go into the language of the system so that they understand what it is the flow of the system, how the money comes to the system, so that based on, from that place of knowledge, that they can then have a conversation about, okay, when we ask the question, what is well-being, that they can answer that. They are definitely the experts of their own lives. And then as they think beyond themselves, that they can have something to say about what is community well-being. I think we all come from a love of family and a love of community and our responsibility to community. But yet, society, and especially with a colonized society, it's more individualistic. And so when we come back to those roots, we're able to then more fully consider, if it's not just me and I have a responsibility to community, then what are those values that then I can have a conversation about what should be happening in our community. And community can be defined in so many different ways. That's why I believe, we could talk sort of national things, but really these things happen in community, whatever that is, that whether it's, a jurisdiction, a county, a neighborhood, to really hear. And we do the data to say, what are the neighborhoods most impacted? What are the zip codes, down to the actual neighborhoods, because we know what those are.
Mhm.
We can go into every single county and we can pull out the zip codes where the most of those kids that are sitting in detention come from, in every single place in this country, county by county. And if we're asking everybody else except for the kids and the families from that zip code, we're still off.
Yes, absolutely. And I think also like when you do that kind of analysis and you pair it with what you were saying, really sort of understanding what actually is there and sort of seeing the comparison points, often there's like a mismatch, right? It's like there's a lot of resources devoted to one thing that is maybe not the thing that everybody wanted, period. Which I think we see a lot. I want to like quickly ask the panelists if there are other points that you all want to share or raise. I know we have a lot of questions that are now coming into the Q&A, and I want to be thoughtful about that. But are there points that any of you want to make before we jump into some of that?
Other than based on the questions in the chat that I'm reading, this group is really savvy about data and committed, the audience is really committed to understanding what they can do with data. So I really commend them for that.
Okay. So yeah, we do have a lot of questions here, and I want to maybe try to use this time wisely if that's okay with our panelists and make it a little more interactive. The first question I see here is from Ian Bryce, and he asks, Marcia, what is the right data? Which is a pretty broad question. So maybe we'll start there and then we'll kind of move into some of the here.
So, I love that question because, for all those years that we did reform work, we had templates, templates and templates that we would give systems. And we would say, give us this information. This is the information that will guide your decision making. And, across the country, it was time tested and proven effective that these reform efforts actually work. And we were able to decrease how many kids in Pima County, where I started to work there and implemented both the JDI and the Burns Institute models. We went from 200 kids to 60 in 5 years. We could have been way down further, I believe. And so, but the question is, what data do you want for what? As we talk about ending incarceration, really it's only looking at who is sitting in detention. Let's break that, let's unpack who's sitting in detention and who could we safely release. So it's different data for different things, but certainly if the drive is to end incarceration, there's not a whole lot of data that you need. Really, it's more the commitment and political will. And to have that data shared with community so that community, we always talk the horse before the cart before the horse. What do we need in the community? Sometimes, as you have already said, Vidya, it's what is already in the community that we're not using, right? And we have so many players in the community that don't get paid for volunteer work that's absolutely passionate and beautiful and works. And yet it's not connected to the system and probation to utilize to help young people successfully return to community and be well in the community. So I'll stop there.
You've raised an interesting point during your answer, which I just want to hit on quickly because we didn't totally get into it before, but it's the importance of transparency and how that promotes accountability. And to what degree, people are really doing that. And, I guess I just want to make a point of that specifically, but also ask, if there are any good practices you've seen with regard to frequency of presentation of that information publicly, or, types of things that are important to sum up for folks. I don't know. Just want to mention that.
Video, of course, there's a move across the country for data dashboards and putting those out on websites and making them accessible and making it so people can actually look at the data in a variety of different ways. When I was administrator, we started moving in that direction, but it was still very limited because it was just telling you the number of kids that were in our system and how long they were there. It wasn't telling you the story of that experience. And I've seen some of the questions asking, well, what are the ways that we can measure success? And of course, it's at a very individual level. When we look at well-being, we've had young people come into our system, and it's the very first time the 14-year-old is seeing a dentist. And we're having to pull 7 teeth because they've never seen a dentist before. We're talking about some of the basic physical health care that communities, for whatever reason, are not meeting, and kids are ending up in our system and then having to have those needs met. So ways to measure whether young people are doing well in our system is we need to look at food and housing security. Are we able to support them in making sure that they feel secure with just meeting some of their basic everyday needs? Are we helping improve their literacy? Are we helping improve family functioning and relationships with others that are close to them? So there's a variety of different ways that we could attempt to come up with some standardized measures. There are no national standards associated with that yet, but I know there's work underway to try and clearly define what is well-being for young people in our juvenile justice system.
Great. Thank you. A lot of the questions that we have include sort of questions about just how to really think about race or measure gender, and like really paying attention to the best way to collect that kind of information and track it. I know that here's one question that says, does it make sense to collect both self-identification and system actor identification in order to track disparate decision-making from system actors? And then separately, there's a different question about a good way to measure race, and should we be using census categories to compare to national population estimates or strive toward how people would actually describe their race? So, I just want to kind of just put those out because they're kind of overlapping and similar.
Yeah, I could briefly just respond to a few of those. I just looked at those questions. So in terms of gender expression and identity and sexual orientation, SOGI data collection, and our dear colleague Angela Irvine is doing a phenomenal job training systems, probation systems, how to collect that data accurately. So anybody who wants to do that well should look up Ceres Policy, CERES. They're doing a really good job around the country. The next question I want to respond to is we're highly recommending to utilize the census's combined question because it combines race and ethnicity. It came out of the Census Bureau did all this research to show that particularly for Brown communities around the country, they responded more accurately in identifying themselves using the combined question than not. And so at least for Brown communities all over the country now, some of the work that the Alianza is going to do in the next year is to break down similarly how in New York they passed a law and in California there's a law that broke down the API into 12 additional boxes. We want to go around the country and ask young people what would be the boxes that they would need to feel comfortable to self-identify. And we want to go, all over New York, Chicago, Florida, Texas, even Brown folks identify differently, Indigenous, they refuse to say Latino or Hispanic, or some use Hispanic, others use Afro-Latino. So it's very important that we actually ask young people what it is and how it is that they'd like to. And then last but not least, yes, self-identification. We understand there's Brown folks who still identify as white. That's a social, race, ethnicity is a social construct that a lot of our young people, they're not taught this in school. And so when they show up at a system and are asked, what is your race? And they look at the boxes, they're like, what is this? I've never filled out a form. I've never been asked. So there is a way in which that can also be taught. that young people can feel comfortable responding to. And I still envision ending incarceration, and that those questions would be done more coming from community, in which way it would be differently asked. But if it is within the system, then how can we teach? What is the ways in which we teach system how to be asking these questions that they can be more accurately responded to?
Thanks, Marcia.
And the only thing that I would add is that I absolutely agree that we should ask young people how they want to be described in these data systems. And I think it's also important for us to think about what our research questions are, like what the community's research questions are, what the agency's research questions are, and make sure that we're saying it plain in the data, and that we're actually capturing the variables that would go into those research questions. Because a lot of times what I think I see in these systems are variables that are proxies for something else. We might say like neighborhood, or we might say zip code, or we might say socioeconomic status. And those are code for communities that have been historically marginalized, communities that have been racially oppressed. And so we need to have variables that reflect the actual research questions. And the same goes for race. I would make the maybe controversial opinion that in addition to expanding our thinking about race and ethnicity, it might be helpful to keep those archaic system generated categories, because they help us answer different questions. If we want to know about how racial identity and culture affect someone's experience in the system, we need to go right to that young person and ask them how they identify. If we want to know how system perceptions of racial identity and culture affect someone's experience, it might be useful to keep those legacy categories, because there might be a significant result with that variable, but not with the variable where the young person is actually telling you how they identify and what their experience in this world is. So I think it depends on the research question, but I would absolutely advocate everyone moving to adding ones that are self-identified if they haven't already.
I think that's a really, really powerful set of points you just made, Amanda, because I think it really speaks to no one wants to just go down the road of collecting data for data's sake, right? And or, whatever data that is, and particularly when we're talking about someone's identity, that it actually has real implications for the things that we want to see happen and how we want young people to be treated, what kinds of supports they need, whether or not they should even be somewhere or not, like there are a lot of reasons around that. So I just think that that notion of really having that end question in mind, like what are we trying to get to? What's the question we're really trying to answer? And how does the data serve that purpose, right? And then what is the best way to do that in a way that's meaningful and accounts for the diversity of people? That's really, I think that's just such an important point. I want to there's a particular question I'm curious about, which is around, presenting data to tell a particular story and communicate specific messages on a topic or for a specific racial or ethnic group. And I don't know if anyone can address that, but just how you've done that in the past, or to what degree you've managed to kind of like take sort of an aggregate look at, a population and then break that down in a way that becomes meaningful, right? To really share a story. And the specific person was talking about Chicanx and Latinx youth, but potentially there could be others.
Yeah, so I did see that question. And so here's the story that we like to, so this is unintended consequences of how we share data or report data. So what I have found, and the Alianza is very much advocating strongly to include beyond rates, to include raw numbers and percentages. So let me give you an example. Here in Santa Clara County, we are 35% of the population, 10 to 18-year-old brown youth. In detention or sitting in juvenile hall, they are 70%. For girls, it's about 80%. But when you do rates, what you see is that Black youth are 5 times more likely than white youth to be sitting in detention, and Latinos or brown youth are about 2. And so what happens is that our community will see rates, because usually rates is the only thing that is described in a report. And this is in national reports. You can look at all kinds of reports to just see this example, is that if you only do rates, what happens is in our community, we'll see that, oh, we're so low. Look at how bad it is for Black youth, that we kind of, do this and we'll say, oh, there's nothing happening in the brown community that we need to be alerted about, that we need to be responding to, that there's any urgency in getting involved and putting our attention on this issue. And so raw numbers, percentages is just as important as rates. So that especially in our community, that's the volume of who sits. And in California, that's the volume. And even in a state report, all they use is rates. So we walk away from understanding that the volume of kids, and then that equates to the neighborhoods. What neighborhoods are most impacted and where is the money being invested to actually address, right? We see this all over the place, all over the country, DSEG money, all these different monies, they're supposed to be focused on the most impacted. But if the most impacted the money isn't going there, then where's the equity in that, right? And so I think that that's the unintended consequences of how we report is just as important to address that, to be sure that we are involving those most impacted.
Great. I think we have time for one more question that I'm going to try to put out, which I think actually is valuable given the time that we're in. And we know that we're seeing sort of a resurgence of these tough on crime narratives. There's a lot of backlash right now. And so someone was asking about how we fight back against attempts to use data to make systems more punitive and or racist. And how do you kind of reconcile a data infrastructure that was created explicitly and implicitly with racial bias and still use it to kind of create positive transformation? So I'm hoping we can walk away with like an up message here, but I do want to just acknowledge the time we're in. So anybody?
I think that's a great question, because unfortunately, people are misinterpreting data and using it to move forward a certain political agenda. And I think as systems, we need to reframe what the conversation should be about, which is about young people have a lot of hope and opportunity for our future, for a positive future. And it's the responsibility of our systems and our communities to lift them up and to be able to take advantage of those opportunities and to make sure that there's hope. And data should be used to help inform, but it also should be used to start a conversation, to question, because I've seen data as an administrator that tells one story, and as you dig deeper into what the data says, it tells you a totally different story. And so we need to be able to really take a comprehensive look at our data and not just rely on numbers and be satisfied that the numbers are telling us the true picture of what's going on.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. And I think we're pretty much at time. I just really want to say this was an excellent panel. I really appreciated all of your participation and active engagement, and to our whole group of community members who were participating and listening. We really, really appreciate all your questions and chatter throughout, because it really informed how this panel went. So I hope you'll stay tuned for the recording, and we'll be putting out additional resources after the fact. But again, thank you, and we hope you'll stay tuned for our next in this series. Appreciate it, everybody. Take care.